Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Leo Cox. Before we get to the video, I'd like to just add a little bit of historical information about the people and events that led to the creation of the park. Glacier National Park and its surrounding areas have had human habitation for more than 10,000 years. The descendants of these early Americans, or Kootenai, can still be found living and working in around Glacier National Park. This includes members of the original Kootenai tribe, plus Blackfeet and also Flathead Indians. Anglo inhabitants didn't arrive until the early 1800s. Most of them were either explorers or people involved in the fur trade. There was not a lot of development or movement after that because the area was so remote. But that changed in the 1880s with the arrival of two very influential individuals. George Bird Grinnell was born in New York City. He graduated from Yale University. He was the editor of Field and Stream magazine and a definite conservationist. He called the area the crown of the continent. He was so associated with the park that there are three things in the park named after him. He has a lake, a glacier, and a mountain, all named after Mr. Grinnell. Lewis Hill was the president of the Great Northern Railroad. He built the railroad, so what does the railroad need? It needs passengers. He knew the people of the East Coast were vacationing in Europe, so he thought he could get them to turn around and come to Glacier for vacation. But they needed some place to stay, they needed lodging, so Mr. Hill also built the hotels and lodges in the park. Between the efforts of Mr. Hill, Mr. Grinnell, and many others, the park was finally established in 1910 as Glacier National Park. It was the 10th park in the system. As a matter of fact, it even beat the system because the national park system did not come into existence until 1916. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps built most of the infrastructure of the park. They built roads, bridges, they even put in telephone lines and sewer lines, well, everything that would make it possible for visitors, such as the ones that you're going to see in this video, enjoy the park. So let's take a look.
In a remote corner of western Montana, a jagged mountain range rises above the pristine lakes and rolling prairies that surround these peaks. Their origins can be traced back through the mists of time to a time 1 billion years ago when the land was covered by a prehistoric ocean. Today, these mountain peaks still pierce the clouds that frequently surround and swirl about them. Come celebrate this land, where hundreds of rushing streams carrying ice-blue water from melting glaciers plunge through narrow gorges and over spectacular waterfalls to silent lakes in the valleys below. This is indeed a rugged land, a land where stony sentinels pierce the clear blue firmament, soaring majestically above the canyons and valleys of this big sky country. This is a landscape that began over 1 billion years ago, as layer upon layer of sedimentary rocks were laid down on the shores of a prehistoric ocean. Some 50 or 60 million years ago, these layers of rock were thrust skyward by tectonic forces from deep within the Earth. In the past 3 million years, a series of glaciers covered this land with masses of ice several thousand feet thick. The broad strokes of the glaciers of the last ice age, just 10,000 years ago, carved the landscape into the lofty peaks and broad valleys that survive today. During each ice age, glaciers attacked the landmass from many directions, resulting in sharp peaks that rise majestically out of valleys that nearly surround them. This distinctive shape is referred to as a horn, as in the famous Swiss Matterhorn. The massive glaciers of the last ice age have retreated. Change is imperceptible now, as wind and water slowly erode the rock that remains. Today, the force of tons of water rushing down these steep mountainsides has little effect on the scene before us. This is still a vast wilderness, home to an array of wildlife unmatched in any region of the lower 48 states, including stately mountain goats, majestic bighorn sheep, and even powerful grizzly bears. Most of this land remains undisturbed by its modern-day visitors. Those who come to these mountains seeking the solitude and beauty of the wilderness certainly find it here. Nearly a century ago, an early preservationist named George Bird Grinnell called this region of northwest Montana the crown of the continent. Other conservation-minded individuals lobbied Congress for action, and in 1910, nearly 1,600 square miles was set aside for future generations with the formation of Glacier National Park. Today, even though the park is removed from large population centers, it is easily accessible to the thousands of visitors who come here annually. The heart of the park is traversed by a roadway which represents a phenomenal piece of engineering. The thin white line on the side of the mountain marks the 52-mile-long Going to the Sun Highway, which opened in 1933. Numerous turnouts along this narrow roadway provide spectacular views for motorists as they travel through the heart of the park. Heaven's Peak is beautifully framed by an opening in a short tunnel on the western slope of the highway. Because the roadway is so narrow, vehicle size limitations are in effect at all times, and bicycles are restricted to non-peak hour usage. Both shuttle buses and open-air jammer buses operate during peak visitor seasons, allowing travelers to concentrate on the scenery without having to worry about watching the road. These colorful red buses were built in the 1930s. Supposedly, the name jammer comes from early drivers who allegedly jammed the gears as they drove to the top of Logan Pass. Just beyond the highway, even more spectacular scenes can be found all along the many miles of hiking trails that traverse the park. All of the trails highlighted in this program are accessible from the Going to the Sun Highway, either by private cars or by shuttle buses operated by park concessionaires. For casual day hikers, the highway is really just an access road to reach the magnificent wonders of this mountain wilderness. The first hike profiled is one of the most beautiful, as well as one of the most popular trails in the park. The 3-mile round-trip Hidden Lake Trail begins at the Logan Pass Visitor Center and climbs almost 500 feet to cross the Continental Divide to an overlook above Hidden Lake. The initial portion of the trail follows a short paved section through a meadow at the foot of Mount Oberlin. The paved section soon turns into a boardwalk that crosses the alpine meadow with its carpet of wildflowers. The trail heads toward the rocky peak of Clements Mountain. Off to your right, small streams fed by midsummer snowmelt trickle off the face of Mount Oberlin. In the distance, the steep face of the thin spine of rock known as the Garden Wall lies in deep early morning shadow. All along the trail, a midsummer blanket of wildflowers, such as these yellow glacier lilies, delights the eye and provides a rich source of food for scores of small birds and animals, including this ptarmigan, still showing some white winter feathers, the Columbian ground squirrel, and the golden-mantled ground squirrel. The boardwalk continues on upward for about 1/2 mile. Even in midsummer, lingering snowfields can cover the path. A series of poles set into the snow marks the trail. As the trail approaches the foot of Clements Mountain, hikers can observe the mountain's peak reaching into the atmosphere, where turbulence causes passing Pacific moisture to condense into thin, wispy clouds. Beyond the boardwalk, the trail skirts a bald mound of loose aggregate that is washed down off the cliffs of Clements Mountain. Make sure that when you pause to get your breath, you utilize the time to take in the striking scene all around you. Down in the valley below, 3 bighorn rams graze on the lush greenery. Near the top of the trail, watch for mountain goats perched on rocky shelves on the mountainside to your right. These sure-footed goats can easily pick their way down rocky hillsides. Goats shed most of their long winter coats by midsummer. The tattered remains of the long coat imparts a ragged look to this otherwise handsome animal. The trail passes through a wind-blown stand of subalpine fir next to a small pond fed by melting snows. In the distance, the flat-top peak of Bear Hat Mountain rises above the scene below. A final rise takes the trail over the Continental Divide at Hidden Lake Pass. Just beyond the pass, a short set of stairs leads to a boardwalk overlook. The alpine slopes draw your attention to the beautiful moraine valley. Hidden Lake lies at the foot of Bear Hat Mountain, which towers 2,300 feet above the clear blue lake. The trail does continue another 1.5 miles down to Hidden Lake, but the trail is often closed because the valley is prime grizzly bear country. Return via the same 1.5 mile trail to the trailhead at the Logan Pass Visitor Center. Turn now from the steady climb of the alpine meadow to a level wheelchair-accessible boardwalk through a deep cedar and hemlock forest. The Trail of the Cedars begins just across the Going to the Sun Highway from the Avalanche picnic area. This loop trail follows a 1/2 mile boardwalk and paved path that first loops around and then follows the banks of Avalanche Creek. Benches and trailside exhibits provide hikers with both a place to rest and a chance to gain an insight into the nature of this superb example of a mature forest. The boardwalk winds through lush stands of hemlock and western red cedar. Ferns and other shade-tolerant plants grow in the protection and nourishment provided by decaying red cedar tree trunks. At one point, the path surrounds a magnificent red cedar that stretches more than 100 feet into the clear air above the boardwalk, a sight hundreds of years in the making. The trail continues along the banks of Avalanche Creek for a short distance until it comes to a bridge over a small gorge. This small slot canyon continues to slowly expand as the creek-draining Avalanche Lake, located some 2 miles farther up the mountainside, cuts into the bedrock. Just past the bridge, a separate trail branches off to Avalanche Lake. This trail will be profiled shortly. The boardwalk ends at the bridge over the gorge. From this point on, the Trail of the Cedars loop is paved as it returns to the roadway. A short paved spur leads to an overlook on the banks of the creek where the rushing water blocks out all other sounds. Beyond this overlook, the trail is more open. Sunlight penetrates the canopy as the cedars and hemlocks give way to spruce and Douglas fir trees. Motionless shadows of the still forest mingle with moving silhouettes of passing hikers. The trail passes an open area near the Avalanche Campground. This small amphitheater includes wooden benches for nature programs. One last short section of boardwalk takes hikers back to the starting point of the hike at the avalanche picnic area. A longer variation of this hike begins back near the bridge over the gorge. The trail to Avalanche Lake is a 4-mile round-trip hike with an elevation gain of 500 feet. The first portion of the trail parallels the small gorge cut by the creek that is fed by runoff from Avalanche Lake. The section just above the gorge follows a rocky path alongside the creek as the trail rises toward the lake. Within a quarter mile, the trail leaves the banks of the creek and heads off into the hemlock forest. Short boardwalks provide a dry passage over areas prone to collect moisture from snowmelt and runoff from heavy rains. The path is generally smooth, partly as a result of the thick soil base built up from shade-tolerant vegetation growing in a rich compost of decaying plant matter. The sound of running water bubbles up from tiny streams that nourish this vast blanket of plants covering the forest floor. A word about bears. The trail to Avalanche Lake traverses a deep forest that is more to the liking of black bears than grizzly bears. Glacier National Park is bear country, and all bears are wild, unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. Hikers must be aware of proper precautions when hiking and remain alert at all times. Many hikers utilize bells attached to a walking stick or to their shoes to avoid surprising bears. However, talking, clapping, and other human noises are probably much more effective. The first look at Avalanche Lake is across a log jam at the outlet arm of the lake. 2 of the 3 streams that feed the lake are visible cascading down the sheer cliffs surrounding the lake. These streams carry water from melting snows and glaciers that remain in lush alpine valleys, some 2,000 feet higher than the elevation of Avalanche Lake. Benches along the shore provide an excellent place to rest while marveling at the beauty of this remote lake that fills the valley carved out by immense glaciers during previous ice ages. From here, return to the trailhead by the same route. On the eastern side of the park, a number of waterfalls can be reached by a series of interconnecting trails that originate near St. Mary's Lake, one of the most photographed features in the park. The Sun Point Nature Trail begins at the far end of the Sun Point parking lot. This trail, which starts out along the shores of St. Mary's Lake, will take us to Bering Falls and via a short side trip to the narrow confines of Sunrift Gorge. A quarter of a mile from the parking lot, the trail heads off into the deep evergreen forest surrounding the lake. The trail passes a junction with a side trail leading up to Sunrift Gorge, which will be visited on the way back to the parking lot. Just over a half mile from the trailhead, the trail crosses a bridge over a small creek carrying water from Bering Falls. The falls originate in a small crack in the rock wall. The water washes across the layered rock wall with its protruding ledge before tumbling over the polished rocks in the stream bed below. Return to the trail junction you just passed for a short uphill hike to Sunrift Gorge. The trail parallels the stream bed as crystal clear water passes over tumbling cascades and small waterfalls on its way down from Sunrift Gorge. The gorge itself is just a few feet uphill from the Going to the Sun Road. This narrow crack in the earth's surface channels the water through its narrow confines to a right-angled curve before surging on down to Bering Falls. Since both Sunrift Gorge and the Sun Point parking lot are stops on the park shuttle system, hikers can either return to the Sun Point parking lot via the same route or take the park shuttle back to the trailhead. A mile up the road from Sunrift Gorge on the way to Logan Pass, a sign marks the trailhead to St. Mary's Falls. This pleasant 3-mile round trip takes hikers first to the base of St. Mary's Falls and then on to Virginia Falls. The initial part of the trail crosses a small meadow as it heads toward the foot of Citadel Mountain. Although the full length of the trail gains 500 feet in elevation, the first quarter mile is mostly downhill. At the bottom of this hill, there is a junction with the Pagan Pass Trail that comes in from the left. A few hundred feet from the first junction, the trails split again, with the trail to St. Mary's Falls now heading off to the left. The trail starts up through a dense stand of Douglas fir trees, interspersed with occasional aspen. As the trail passes a rock wall on the right, the sound of rushing water from the St. Mary's River breaks the stillness of the forest. A little less than a mile from the trailhead, the trail passes over a bridge at the base of St. Mary's Falls. Here, crystal clear water from glaciers high above rushes over and through a narrow crevice in the rock wall. Virginia Creek joins St. Mary's River just below the falls. The river then continues its way down the mountainside to feed St. Mary's Lake. Beyond the bridge at St. Mary's Falls, the trail continues its way up the mountainside to Virginia Falls. A few hundred yards after leaving the St. Mary's River, the trail reaches a rocky overlook at the edge of Virginia Creek. Some visitors mistake this section of the creek for Virginia Falls. The rushing water follows a fault in the stream bed as it slowly deepens the slot. The stream continues on its way through layers of sedimentary rock as it surges to the valley below. Beyond this overlook, the trail heads off to the right of the creek. The last segment of the trail becomes much narrower, an indication that this section of the trail is not widely traveled by hikers. Just a mile and a half from the trailhead, the trail crosses another small bridge that takes you across Virginia Creek to the base of the beautiful cascade that is Virginia Falls. The sound of rushing water fills the air as tons of water pour over a series of rocky steps to briefly rest in a crystal clear pool at the base of the falls. The trail to Pagan Pass is a strenuous 9-mile round-trip hike with an elevation gain of just over 1,700 feet. The top portion of the trail follows a narrow path across the barren face of Mount Saya on its way to the pass. The trailhead is 2 miles east of Logan Pass at a point where Saya Creek passes under the Going to the Sun Road. The lush greenery along the creek is accented by wildflowers, such as this clump of Indian paintbrush. The trail leaves the creek and heads into deep forest. The craggy pinnacle of Reynolds Mountain looms in the western sky. Soon the breaks in the trees give way to small meadows that dot the mountainside as the trail continues its upward climb toward the tree line. The tumbling waters of Saya Creek cross the trail just beyond the halfway point of the hike. A sturdy bridge carries hikers over the stream to a slightly steeper section of the trail. As the trail nears the tree line, summertime meadows full of glorious wildflowers border the path. As the trail breaks out of the trees and onto the bald southern face of Mount Saya, a rocky outcropping in the foreground frames the jagged outline of the distant garden wall. Even on this southerly facing slope, it's not uncommon to encounter small snowfields at these higher elevations. Colorful ground-hugging alpine plants quickly flower to complete their life cycles during the short summer months. The lack of physical reference points makes it difficult to judge distances. The open section of the trail is more than a mile long. From the top of the pass, hikers can marvel at the east face of the garden wall and look down into the valley and the continuation of the trail that leads to the Swift Current Lake area. Few hikers make this strenuous trip, but you are not alone up here. The animal kingdom is well represented by marmots scurrying about the fallen rocks, and the regal symbol of this high mountain region, a small herd of bighorn sheep rams. From the top of a rocky mountain pass to the cool depths of a mature forest, Glacier is truly a natural wonderland. We are indeed fortunate that visionary pioneers saved this land on the crown of the continent for future generations to enjoy. It is our duty to preserve this legacy for generations of day hikers yet to come.
If you enjoyed this program, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series.